Hi and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma. And as you know, we are hurtling towards our first birthday. I can't believe it's a first birthday. 51 episodes. I don't even know how many episodes, Mike. So we are living and leading and decision-making in the delta of change. And there's been that phrase that we simply can't achieve what we want tomorrow if we're using yesterday's logic. Looking at new things through a lens of yesterday and just hoping that everything will be okay isn't going to cut the mustard. So this episode is Breakthrough by Design with Mike Straw. So come back to me just after this.
You're listening to the Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Hey and welcome to Mike Straw, who's the founder and CEO of Achieve Breakthrough. Mike, welcome to it's episode 51. I got the number wrong. So 55 soon, 51 right now. How are you, sir?
Very, very well. I'm so looking forward to the fact that it's your first birthday coming up very soon.
I'm not really sure how that happened, how what was a lockdown project turned into the Leadership Enigma. But I'm very, very grateful and privileged it has, because I get to talk to great people like you. I get to learn a lot. There are now many listeners of the podcast who I'm sure are getting real wisdom and pearls of insight from people. So Mike, tell us a little bit about you, because we're going to talk about Breakthrough by Design. And I know your organization, Achieve Breakthrough, is doing incredible work with organizations and the individuals within those organizations. But as I say to all of my guests, there's a story, there's a journey behind the person. Mike, tell us a little bit about yours.
Well, I grew up in the south of England, and all I ever really did was sail. So everything was about sailing, competition, and all of those. And I kind of wandered. I went through college, and then I went to university, and had a really great time. But everything was around sailing.
Okay.
And there was a moment where I saw this advert for a recent graduate to put in a raw material control system into this factory in Hackney. And I thought, oh, okay, I don't know what one of those is, but what I really saw was a certain salary in a Rover car. And in those days, the Rover car was the pinnacle. But the story was because I wanted to be in London, and I needed a car to tow my boat around the country and around Europe.
Okay.
So I took this job. Unbeknown to me, it was the best experience I'd ever had, because it was when Hackney in East London wasn't that cool and trendy in those days. And this factory made quality street tins. But for those of you who don't know, they're like a cultural signal of the UK. But they made tins and biscuit tins, so it wasn't particularly sexy. But what it did was a raw material control system was like an early version of a big Oracle or SAP system. So you suddenly knew the business from back to front. And after about 3 years of doing this, I got made acting production director, because the guy who was running went off sick. And so I was 24, this factory of about 300 people running production with this very diverse group of people who were from every sort of origin and ethnic background. And it was amazing. And then after about 3 or 4 years, they decided that I wasn't going away. So they decided, well, look, we'll put you on this training. And I went on this thing called Breakthrough Thinking, run by a company in Oxford called Breakthrough Technologies, who actually we later bought as Achieve Breakthrough. But I went there, and it was like it blew my mind. And it blew my mind really because what it was saying was that people act on stories of the past, and based on those stories of the past, they live them into the future. Right. And I hadn't even really thought about any of this sort of stuff. So suddenly it lit a flame inside of me. And I went back to work, and I had all these ideas about what we could do on production. And there was this machine in the corner that had been basically someone had put a cloth over it and it become a bench. But if we got that out and got that working, we could increase productivity by 30% on the lines. And I just got hit by this wall of why that wasn't possible. And now with this newfound thinking, I was thinking, those are all stories. None of that's true.
Yeah.
But I couldn't kind of get through it. So I phoned up. I phoned up later on that week and phoned up Breakthrough Technologies to my old boss actually and said, look, I thought it was irresponsible putting me through a 2-day workshop because I'm now torturing myself, and that I'd like to work for them. And they were a bit taken aback, but they said yes. And then so that was about 25 years ago, and that's when I started getting into this field. And it kind of what it's all about is actually, how do you unlock the potential of people for a thriving world? How do you unlock what's possible? And that's kind of really what I've dedicated my life to, and then sort of spent my life doing in every walk. And I think before I kind of knew the essence of it, but it was unconscious. Now it's conscious, and you can help translate it to other people, which has been brilliant.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because as human beings, we are capable of so much. But I suppose, like all of us, we're hostages, aren't we, to our history in some way. So the successes, to the challenges, to the failures, and we tell ourselves stories, don't we? And we relive those stories. And maybe I'm only speaking for myself. Sometimes 2 and 2 equals 5, which means that's entirely wrong.
Yeah, there is, and I think it's funny because when a lot of organizations at the moment talk about mindset change and culture change and all of that stuff, and they go, we need a mindset change or a culture change, and you say, oh, we need to improve morale, and you ask them, okay, where's morale in your organization? Where is morale? And they look around and they go, what do you mean? I said, where is morale? So it's like, well, it's a thinking, it's in your head, it's a feeling, it's what's in your heart.
The intangible.
And then you go, like, unless you employ someone called morale, actually morale, and there's morale over there, that person you employ, morale is actually a conversation we have in our heads or out loud or write down on a piece of paper about what's possible in the organization, what isn't. So when you look at culture and transformation and mindset change as it's actually a conversation, and you're looking to alter the conversation the organization is, it means you can start to wrestle with this this notion of mindset change and actually get your arms around it, because you're talking about changing the conversation, changing the stories that an organization orientates itself around.
I suppose we have to change the internal dialogue before we can change the external dialogue. Would that be right, Mike?
Yeah, definitely.
Now, you and I spoke just before we went on air, if that's a term I can use. And you know that I did an episode with Roderick Yap, who was former commanding officer with the Royal Marines, and we talked a lot about context. And I know that you say that context is crucial. So help us understand your view on why context is so crucial for leaders today.
Yeah, so I think that there's an addiction in most organizations they get some results, they analyze those results, then they put in a new process, system, methodology, or structure to get a different outcome. And all of that happens inside of the context. And when I'm talking about context, I'm meaning the human environment that governs the success of any process, system, or methodology. And the human environment is the organization's frame of reference, its conversation. That context determines the success of everything. So you could have the best idea in the world, but if people's internal dialogue, we call it the little voice inside your head is saying, that's not going to work.
Or the critic.
Actions are correlate with that. So in my view, the context is fundamentally decisive. It frames what is possible and not possible. And most organizations don't have the ability to shift the context. And that, for me, is a crucial muscle to build, certainly if you're wanting to make breakthroughs happen.
And Mike, is there a balance between, because a lot of organizations work very hard in the physical context and environment that they create, but there must be a balance, I'm assuming, with that internal context that's being created, and as you say, the inner voice or the inner critic or the inner fan, whatever it might be. What is your view in relation to how that blends, or how that is congruent, if at all?
Yeah, so I think you actually can't separate the two. I think they're like a close brother and sister, both sides of the coin, because one side of the coin is whatever's happening in the external environment. And then the other side of the coin is what you then say about that and about what your organization is. So let's say someone invents the next new technology, and one of their competitors goes, oh no, and explains that technology away. Like, no, that won't really work and it won't work here. That internal dialogue they have in relation to what's happening externally then shapes the action they take. If they have a different internal dialogue, which is, okay, so that's what they've done over there, how do we leverage and what's next? Then it's a very different set of actions. So I think that's where you get organizations that tend to disappear and not, and it's interesting because we often say that the status quo, if you will, is a super magnet, even for enlightened organizations. So it's that internal dialogue is often reinforcing the status quo in the face of whatever's happening in the market conditions. And I think one of the challenges for most organizations that we come across with is the external environment is changing so rapidly now. I think COVID has just accelerated or just made it so obvious. It's changing so rapidly that if we can't shift our own internal speed and dialogue in relation to the marketplace, then we'll be left behind, because the next impossible thing will be invented. It's just whether it will be your competitors or you, and that's all about, I think, the power of context, really.
Or a couple of 18-year-olds in a garage somewhere might invent the next big thing. I love that quote, the status quo is a super magnet. And there's that phrase, it may have been Jack Welch, that if the pace of change externally is faster than the pace of change internally, then the end is in sight. So that takes me on to asking you, this episode is called Breakthrough by Design. So give us an overview of what you mean now by breakthrough by design.
So if you ask people, give me an example of a breakthrough, often people go to Man on the Moon. And you're absolutely right, because in like 1962, when JFK said we're going to take someone to the moon and bring them back again, that NASA didn't know whether the lunar surface was solid, the metals for the rocket hadn't been made, all of those things. And 7 years later, it's as if we grew cosmic wings and suddenly flew to the moon, and Armstrong said his wonderful words. And a lot of people say that was a triumph of technology.
Yep.
But in our view, I think it was actually a triumph of a thinking process. And the thinking process is what we call breakthrough thinking. And the thinking process is, how do you take the impossible? So how do you take the seemingly impossible from impossible to possible to real? But what that really requires is us to get beyond this super magnet, but actually start to get free of our conventional wisdom, our baggage, our experiences and assumptions where they're not helping us.
Right.
And so that this part getting freedom, and there was actually a lovely interview with Gary Kasparov, the grand chess master,
Yes.
and it was interviewing, I think it was in Wired magazine or something like that, about your 7 grand masterships, which was the hardest. And he said, well, it wasn't the first because no one knew who I was. It wasn't the second because everyone thought I just got lucky on the first, but it was the third. And the third, they all knew my moves, my strategy, how I would open games, all of that. So I had to unlearn everything that made me successful. But once I got the muscles to unlearn, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th weren't so difficult. And he then coined a beautiful phrase, which was, you've got to escape the gravity of success. And there's a fine line between our experience and our baggage. And I think that's what I mean about getting freedom. It's getting freedom from not our experiences that we want to cherish, the factual experiences, but getting free of the story or the baggage that we hold, that often is a set of assumptions that own us versus us owning our assumptions in a way.
Gotcha. There are some wonderful nuggets in there. I'm writing feverishly, Mike, as you were talking. It also takes me back to thinking of Roger Bannister and the 4-minute mile. You said impossible to possible to real. There was a belief, wasn't there, that no human could run the 4-minute mile, and then Roger Bannister did just that, and then many people did just that. Is that another example of this in action?
Yeah, totally. Totally in action. And it's interesting. They even had scientific papers of what was going to happen to you internally if you ever ran that fast. But you're absolutely right. That's exactly. And interestingly, the pandemic has. I actually came off. I remember doing a coaching call with someone about probably last May last year, and he worked in the quality department of a big pharma. And he said, you know what? I've been trying to get DocuSign, electronic signature of documents, into our quality systems for the last 3 or 4 years, and just been told no. Suddenly, DocuSign is everything. What's changed? And he said, like all of the data points that told us that we couldn't do it, were all rubbish. And they've all been swept to one side. And of course, DocuSign's fine. So he's sitting there chewing the side of his mouth, trying not to lose his temper. So that for me is examples of where we suddenly become free of our assumptions that we thought were true. And when you become loudly aware of them, you realize that they're not. And at that moment, you can break through.
Yeah, I suppose it means that we and our internal dialogue can be our biggest supporter and our biggest critic. And so help me understand this and help the listeners understand this, the difference between conventional thinking and breakthrough thinking.
Yeah, so conventional thinking is thinking that is very much anchored in the past, anchored in your past experiences, your past assumptions, ways of working, the groove. So conventional thinking is anything that's in there. So if you're doing your expenses or something, then conventional thinking is perfect for it. So you only really need breakthrough thinking when you're trying to take on something that isn't possible based on, isn't predictable or possible based on past experiences. Right. So breakthrough thinking, it starts with being aware of getting free of your history and baggage, but then there's a vital ingredient that actually breakthrough thinking starts by declaring something, going for something, committing to something that you may not have any evidence for, but it is your idea of a good time and it is what you really, really want. Not to burst into Spice Girls, but it is like that. It's something that you really, really want to do. And it's the courage to really go for it and really commit. But wholeheartedly, we often say that you're either full on or you're full off. So to really commit to something that you really want to make happen. That's kind of how breakthrough thinking starts.
Gotcha. Now, if you do want to burst into a rendition of a Spice Girls song, that will be a leadership enigma first, Mike. So you go for that. I want to come back to really your methodology. I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that there are 4 elements or 4 key elements to your methodology in relation to breakthrough by design. I've got those as liberating thinking, sparking ambition, 100% responsibility, and taking rapid action. Do I have that right, Mike?
Yeah. That's you probably said it nicer, actually. You have, and the liberating thinking is liberating it from the past. The sparking ambition is really about actually committing to what you really want to accomplish. And there's an analogy I would have is if you imagine you lived in a block of flats and you were in the middle of this block of flats, and I said to you, what do you really want? You may say, well, I'd like to live at the top of the block of flats so I can kind of see the city. And I said, yeah, but if you could have that, what do you really, really want? It's like, well, I actually don't want to live in a block of flats at all. I'd like a house by a garden, a house with a garden and maybe by a lake. So most people only ever commit to what they can do based on their history. The budgeting process in a lot of organizations is looking at increasing the budget or increasing incrementally. Now, if you're wanting to make something exponential happen, there's usually a vision gap. So it requires you to go to that house with a garden by the lake, to go really bold. Now, when you invite people into that, when they've liberated themselves from their sort of past history, you invite people into that. That's where it starts. Once you're there, yep. Then it's about getting into action from that place. So it's taking bold action from that place. So imagine standing in the result that you've actually achieved that bold commitment you've done. What action would you take that's congruent from that?
Okay.
That's the in a nutshell. The key piece though is this responsibility, because so often us as human beings, not leaders, but just us as general human beings, when the circumstances come around, like something doesn't happen or the wind changes or a pandemic arrives, it's very easy to, our relationship with the circumstances is like, that's hopeless, I couldn't do anything. This work, it's about saying whatever happens in the circumstance, I'm still 100% responsible for however I choose to respond.
Right.
In an organizational level, that's the same as, let's say you're in a procurement department and no one's following the procurement rules. Very easy for people to say, well, that's everybody else's fault, versus how is it that we show up as procurement that has people not follow the rules, and let's take responsibility for that. So when you go into this work, you suddenly become this place of, I'm 100% responsible for everything that happens around me. That doesn't mean I do everything, but I see myself as cause in the matter. Interestingly, if you go the other side of that, if you're not 100% responsible, at some level, you're a victim to whatever happens. So it's standing in that place of, a pioneer doesn't complain and moan about what isn't working. They work out another way in that set of circumstances. That's a key ingredient, really.
Now, for someone who specializes in breakthrough by design, which you've done for decades and worked with some of the biggest global organizations and the leadership teams within them, you've also had to deal with a pandemic. We've all had to, and it's been deeply personal. What have been some of the key learnings for you then through the last 15 months and a global pandemic? What's that done for you?
I mean, it's certainly been emotional. No, when it happened, I think like a lot of the UK, we didn't know if it was going to get to it. So when it happened, it was like by surprise. But within 2 weeks, we had lost 70% of our order book, like 70% of everything. And it was interesting because it was workshops that were people saying, you know what, we're going to do, but we were going to do it in May. We'll now just put it to June and it'll be fine. So we decided, okay, that's all gone. And very fortuitously, I went to a book signing by a wonderful lecturer, thought leader called Margaret Heffernan. And she's written a brilliant book called Uncharted, and also another book called Willful Blindness a few years before.
Right.
But I went there just as the bottom was falling out of all of our order book. And there's about 30 people who work in Achieve Breakthrough. So you're sitting there thinking, my goodness, what do we do? And she reminded me of a number of things. So I remember writing down on a Post-it stamp and stick it on my laptop. I've actually still got it on here, of how are you going to be in the face of all of these circumstances? So what I actually wrote, I'll read it off the Post-it stamp. What it actually said is have perspective. You're great. The work you do is great. So have perspective. This is a moment in time. Like, this wasn't a time to doubt yourself. This was a time to stand solid in what you do. The second thing I wrote down was use your agency, set yourself free, give yourself permission to just go nuts, set yourself free and experiment, act quickly, go far and go fast. And it reminded me of an old biology lesson, like decades ago. I mean, I don't remember anything about biology, but I do remember this. And it was this study of fungus, that if you put fungus in a series of petri dishes, and you give it light and you feed it, it's got lots of water, it stays in this bulbous mass in the center.
Yep.
If you starve it of energy, so light or water, what fungus does is it actually goes off in long spider-like tentacles. So it spreads and goes off to get energy, in effect.
Right.
And what it symbolized for me is that actually what we needed to do in this set of circumstances was experiment, act quickly, go fast, go far, to see what was out there, like the fungus spreading. And then the last thing that we were clear on was that you can't forecast, but you can be prepared. So this notion of preparedness. So we created that North Star for ourselves of have perspective, use your agency, experiment, go far, go fast, go as quickly as you can. You can't forecast, so don't try, but just you can be prepared. And I think what that did was, to tell the end of the story, within 8 weeks, we got up to the pipeline was the same. And then a year later, we've actually grown we've had the best year ever. We've grown, 40%. So we've had a phenomenal time. And we've been fortunate. We got great companies that we work with, but also I think the need for transformation, the need for thinking differently has never been more prevalent. And I think the pandemic has given organizations a window of how they can challenge their status quo, how they can challenge the super magnet, how they can do things differently, and have got lots of evidence. What we hope now is that memory doesn't fade and we don't get back, the super magnet doesn't take back over.
I love that, and people are going to be thinking of fungus in a petri dish now, and spreading far and fast. So this might be an unfair question, or even a ridiculous question, but are you seeing, what is the biggest barrier that you're seeing in organisations preventing them from change, and has that in itself changed during the pandemic? But what keeps coming to the top of the list for you?
I think there's two or three things. I think one of the things we're picking up on a lot is I think people are exhausted.
Yeah.
I think they're exhausted. I think they're tired. there was an article, I don't know what it was in, but there was this term made called languishing, that were kind of languishing around. I don't know who said it or whatever, but it did capture something.
It's spot on though.
Yeah, it was really good. And it's like people, so I feel that one of the barriers at the moment, and it may be very much pandemic related, is people are tired. And so, you know, and things are moving so quickly. So if you're looking to want to be at your, you know, people say, I'm tired, I've got too many things on. And then someone says, well, prioritize. And it's like, blimey, you know, it takes energy to prioritize. So if you imagine you're not fully charged. So I think one of the challenges is people not being fully charged at the moment. So, and so not being at their most resourceful. I think the second thing I'm noticing is that, there is a lot of unpredictability in the world, and people are trying to forecast again. I think the model of forecasting and control is coming back in, and I think we're not going to be able to get there. I think it needs this much more visionary coach architecting of the change,
or preparedness.
I think that style of leadership needs to come to the fore even more. And I feel that things are getting more, we're trying to get more order into chaos, but we're doing it from a protect, comply, control place versus a more of an expansion in a way.
Gotcha. Now, if we're talking about fatigue, and I think we're all experiencing that, and unpredictability, what could leaders do in order to try and deal with both of those when we start to get back into some form of routine? Whatever that is, no one really knows what it's going to be. But any advice that you've got for leaders to try and compensate or mitigate for that fatigue and unpredictability and trying to get people's battery recharged?
I think that we talked right at the beginning of this, that context is decisive. Now, context is the little voice, the conversation that you are. So I think the leaders actually need to take their mask off in a way, and invite the rest of their team to take their mask off to talk about, you know, where people are, how they're feeling, but not from like there is empathy there, but more from, so what is it that's, in a way, there's like 4 questions. If you imagine, like, what lifts us up and thrusts us forward, and what is weighing us down and dragging us backwards, and how can we find a way through that? But it's through the dialogue, I think, that would, if you came from a place of, look, imagine a battery, how do we get ourselves fully charged? Usually it's from spending time on the things that lift us up and thrust us forward, and reducing the stuff that's drag us back and weigh us down.
Right.
So I think that's a dialogue that I would invite leaders to do to help people be responsible for their own fatigue, but help people be a bit more fully charged in that respect.
Again, I think that's great advice, and it's wonderful that those 4 questions you mentioned are now part and parcel of the wisdom of the leadership enigma. Now, Mike, I want to know, how can people get hold of you, getting to continue the conversation, to actually get your help in relation to the challenges that they've got? I know the little black book of change I have here, Mike. Thank you for sending that.
Yes.
I know you wrote that with Paul Adams as well, and you're very proud of that, and thank you for sending that to me. But how can people get in touch?
Best way to get in touch is either to get in touch with me at Achieve Breakthrough. So that's mike.straw@achievebreakthrough.com.
Right.
Or just go straight to www.achievebreakthrough.com and get in touch with us there. It'd be great.
Okay. And here's the question that I always have at the end is, and you've had a little bit of time to think about this now, Mike, so no pressure. What is the best piece of leadership advice that you've given or received?
That's good. I think it's one that I come back to all the time, which was that if you don't deal with someone else's agenda, they won't deal with yours. So if you don't stand in their shoes and deal with their point of view or their view of the world, they'll never deal with yours. And I'm going to throw in another one, actually, that's just popped into my mind.
Oh, 2 for the price of 1. Let's bring that on.
Is someone said, every time you integrate, you unify. So every time you integrate either different points of view, different agendas that companies have, every time you integrate, you unify. And the most flexible always leads. So the person that can integrate, unify, and is flexible will always lead.
Those are two wonderful nuggets for that particular question. Listen, Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Time has flown by. I hope you've enjoyed being part and parcel of the Leadership Enigma, almost at the point of the first birthday anniversary event. I don't know what that means yet, but thank you very much for being an amazing guest.
No, thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.